Okay, Sam's Bulldog here. Finally got some fresh content worth listening to from the New Atheists that frankly didn't involve politics, which I have a huge interest in, but not out of those mouths. And I think a lot of people share my views that scientists, philosophers, and so on are welcome to chime in on politics, but my advice would be to move on to what you're good at, what you're talking about, because that's why we listen. So it's been a dull summer as far as fresh content, and lo and behold, Jordan Peterson was on Joe Rogan the Joe Rogan Experience at Powerful JR8 number 1006. It's released September. I think it was broadcast like September 1st, 2017. Anyway, it's Jordan Peterson and this guy Brett Weinstein, who I don't know. I haven't even Googled his name. Wanted to go in fresh. I heard a Jordan Peterson friend of mine tell me he was really loving it, the podcast that is. Then I saw Sam Harris send a funny tweet that said that this was a great podcast except where they spoke about him. And then somebody asked a question like, are you ever happy with the way your views are characterized? And he responded, yeah, I don't complain when they're correct. And then he was asked, are you satisfied here? And he said no. So I'm almost certain this is it. I haven't listened to the larger podcast yet. This is Jordan Peterson on Sam Harris and the Nature of Truth. I zipped through it, and it's a little long, okay? And they only hit on Harris a few times, which sparks conversation, but mischaracterize his views, get his views wrong. Then he doubles down on Constructivist Epistemology. Okay, it's true if it helps us, which is a circular. Well, we'll get there. He should know better than bring that up again. And we'll talk about that. But then this Brett Weinstein brings up refutations that he himself knocks down. I mean, it's really funny. But of course, the key is got Harris wrong, and I'll point it out. Let's get it started.
I started. See, because I'm interested in this idea of strengthening the individual. When I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, it was about ideological conflict. And it was about whether or not there was any alternative to ideological conflict, because you could make a case that there isn't. There's right and there's left and there's a war, right? But there is a third way, and I think that is the way of the heroic individual, and I mean that technically. And that involves the development of individual character so that you can say what it is that you think, that you can articulate your experience properly, and that you can bring what it is that's unique to you into the collective landscape. And that's what updates the collective landscape. It's absolutely vital. And so I started doing these biblical lectures. I've done 12 of them now, walking through Genesis, and what I'm trying to do, because I believe that the Bible is the documentation of the emergence of the idea of the divine individual. That's essentially what it is. And we have a very uneasy relationship with that collection of texts now, because we read them as if they're making claims about the objective nature of the world, and those claims seem to be false from a scientific perspective. I don't believe that those are the claims that were made to begin with, so I think it's a non-starter. But I've been trying to lecture about the stories in Genesis, for example, in a manner that makes them accessible to people who are, well, to atheists, let's say. And many, many atheists have been responding very positively to them. I have people in my YouTube comments now that are calling themselves Christian atheists, because they can understand. They understand what it is
Just for the record, you cannot be a Christian atheist. I mean, you can call yourself whatever you want, but pretty much the rule of thumb on Christianity is the resurrection. That is the one central dogmatic claim you must believe. That's what it means to be Christian. To take on that assumption. take on that assumption, it's to invalidate and anathematize, obviously, for all time, the concept of atheism. So, and I'm not going to comment on what he opened with there, which was a bit of silliness. Let's move on. Describing
this idea that's emerged in the West, that consciousness is the mediator between chaos and order, and the generating the phenomena that generates experience, and that you can think about that as a divine category of existence. And
it's not divine that you can think about it as a divine category of existence. I call it the conscience, and yes, that's where we do all our experiencing, and that's the go between chaos and order. I mean, it's what we use to get along. It's our brain. It's florid language, man. Terrible.
And I've been trying to delineate how the biblical stories lay out the pathway by which the divine individual should manifest him or herself in time, because that is what it is. And I've been studying, for example, the Abrahamic stories, which I didn't know well. And the Abrahamic stories are really interesting. I mean, Abraham is called by God. And when Abraham is called by God, he's old. He's like one of these guys who's 40 years old and has stayed in his mother's basement. That's Abraham. It's a little late for Abraham to be getting the hell out there in the world. And God basically says to him, leave your family and your friends and your place of comfort and journey into the land of the stranger. That's the call to adventure. And so Abraham does that. Now he's chosen by God. You think, well, everything goes well for Abraham. That isn't what happens at all. The first thing he encounters is a famine. And to escape that, he flees into the tyranny of Egypt, where they try to steal his wife. It's like, beware of being called by God. You know, you'd think it'd be all sweetness and light after that. It's not that at all. And it's a very realistic story. It's like, get the hell out of where you're safe, into what you don't know. What are you going to find there? Well, your fortune. No, you're going to find the catastrophes of life. But if you keep yourself morally oriented and you make the right sacrifices, which is the Abrahamic story to a T, then you can transcend the catastrophe of being and prevail. I mean, it's
the catastrophe of being, Mr. Deepak Chopra.
Who the hell doesn't want to hear that?
So we're treading kind of close to the argument you got into with Sam Harris about the nature of truth, and since I heard that, I've been sort of itching to have this conversation with you, because I think there's a way of viewing this that will actually perhaps reconcile the 2 points of view, but there's a bitter pill that comes along with it. So here's my argument. We tend to think of intellect as having evolved because knowing what's true gives you an advantage. But there's actually nothing that says that the literal truth is where advantage lies. And so I have a category that I call literally false, metaphorically true.
I refute that idea. It's absurd. I mean, in the narrow context, yes, perhaps. But truth as in facts. The fact that this pond is empty of fish and that pond is full of fish and they're 10 miles apart, and it's a journey to go there. Having the fact of knowing which one to go to might help survival, right? I mean, facts are worth having, my friend.
These are ideas that aren't true in the factual sense, but they are true enough that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would be if you behaved according to the fact that they're not true. So let me give you a couple of trivial examples that won't be controversial. Porcupines can throw their quills. Not true. However, if you live near porcupines and you imagine that porcupines can throw their quills, you'll give them some space. If you don't, you may, realizing that they can't throw their quills, get really close to one, and it may wheel around and nail you with a porcupine quill, which can be extremely dangerous because they are microscopically designed to move in from where they puncture you over time, and they can puncture a vital organ or you can get an infection. So the person who believes that a porcupine can throw their quills has an advantage that isn't predicated on the fact that this is actually a literal truth, right? Another one might be people say everything happens for a reason, right? unless you're talking about physics as the reason, everything doesn't happen for a reason. However, if you are the kind of person who believes that everything happens for a reason, and then some terrible tragedy befalls you, you may be on the lookout. Well, what's the reason that this happened? Maybe it's supposed to open some opportunity, and you won't miss that opportunity the way somebody who was preoccupied with their misfortune would. So, literal falseness, but metaphorical truth, is actually, I would argue, the category under which religious truth evolves. Now, the problem, the bitter pill that I mentioned, is that I've heard you say that the truths that are captured in the religious version of things are basically like, there's an individual truth, and then there's a truth of your family, and there's a truth of the population that you're living in, and these things are all encoded in these doctrines, which is true, and you would expect it to be because the doctrines are carried along in the population. The problem is, what I hear you arguing, you tell me if I have it wrong, is that we should therefore expect the encoded metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be morally right. But there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right, because there are metaphorical truths that might in fact be reprehensible, but nonetheless effective. And so, what I would argue the overarching point here would be that you're right that the documents that contain these descriptions of things are full of things that are true in some sense that is not literal scientific truth, nor was that their purpose. What isn't true is that those things are inherently up to date.
First of all, the first thing about that is that a discussion like that, and this is also what happened with Sam Harris, takes me to the very limits of my intellectual ability. And so, even in...
All right. I mean, I disagree with his premise that there's... If his premise is that this is valuable, I would disagree. When is it a great time not to have the facts? When is it a great time to only use intuition and forego facts? The answer is never. Okay. Now, this porcupine analogy is interesting because it kind of suckers you into saying, yeah, that could work. But then you realize, well, how about a kid who thinks porcupines can throw his quills, staying so far away from a porcupine that he gets to the edge of a precipice to avoid him and ends up falling to his death. So, in other words, his lack of his fear, or he did not scale with the facts, and it cost him his life. You're never. This is again. You're never at a place where you say, "Let's not deal with the facts. Let's look elsewhere." There is no other elsewhere. I think they're about to refute just what he said. In other words, well, let's see. The other point I want to make is, he said the bitter pill you have to swallow is that there aren't literal truths here, there aren't scientific truths here, they're going to use Christianity presumably as the example, and the texts in Christianity and so on. And the morality tales within are not morally up to date. In fact, they're reprehensible, 9 out of 10 of them, as we all know. And that's the problem. This is the point that Weinstein just made. Now, that is certainly true, okay? You just got to read the books. Now, but what do theologists do? What is theology? Theology is telling the people that happen to be alive today how these books are still relevant. They aren't. The morality tales are terrible. We can read these stories and so on, but I would argue, we certainly don't need Jordan Peterson theology student to now resurrect these stories of being anything more than what they are.
Discussing it, I'm going to make all sorts of mistakes because it's treacherous territory. But I would say my understanding of the great myths has that observation built into it. So one of the archetypes is that of the tyrannical father, which is the archetype, by the way, that possesses the minds of people who accuse Western society of being patriarchal. They're possessed by a singular archetype, and that's the archetype of the tyrannical father. They don't see that there's a tyrannical father and a wise king, because there is. That's you can't even point that out. But anyways, in some of our oldest stories, there's a representation of the dead past. So let me give you an example that everyone knows about. The story of Pinocchio is the story of the individualization of Pinocchio. He starts out as a puppet. He's a marionette. He's a wooden head. He's a liar. And he's pulled by forces that he does not understand. Right, okay, but he has a good father. That's Geppetto. And so he's got and Geppetto wishes that he becomes a real individual. And he knows that that's an impossible wish. He wishes on a star that his son could become an actual individual, knowing full well that that's unlikely and impossible. So Geppetto's a good king. But the story is also about Geppetto, because what happens is that when Geppetto loses Pinocchio, loses his son, which you could think about as the active, dynamic, attentive force of youth, then he ends up stultified in the belly of a whale, which is a symbol of chaos, at the bottom of the ocean, and then Pinocchio has to rescue him. So I would say there is an instantiation of evolutionarily accumulated wisdom in the great stories of the past, but they're still dead. And it requires the union. This is why in Christian theology, the Godhead has a tripartite structure. This is part of the reason. There's God the Father, but the Father's dead. The Father was right 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago and is still partly right, but he's dead. He can't participate in the updating of the process. So you need an active force. Now, the active force is the same thing that generated those stories across time, right? So it's the same thing, except it's also alive in the present. And so your moral duty, and this is another thing that happens in Pinocchio, is to rescue your dead father from the belly of the whale. And that's partly what I'm trying to do with these biblical lectures, because your objection is correct. The reason it's correct is because even if the solution was correct, the landscape has changed. And it's changed incrementally or in a revolutionary way. We don't know. And so those old truths are at best partial and at worst blind. But that doesn't mean you can just say, like Mao did during the Cultural Revolution, well, let's just destroy the past. It's like, no, that would be like saying, well, you don't need a body anymore, because your body is the collected wisdom of the evolutionary process across 3.5 billion years.
I absolutely agree. Because the stories are not literal, it's impossible to know whether not impossible, but very difficult to know whether or not the truth that is contained metaphorically is still relevant, if it's been inverted and it's now absolutely false,
So Carl Jung talked about this a lot. And one of the things he said was that your moral duty is to realize the archetype in the confines of your own life. And so you say, well, there's an archetype of perfection that pervades the West. And for the sake of argument, I'm going to call that Christ, the Christ image. It's something like that. That's the archetypal image. Now, we have a story about what Christ's historical life was like. Well, you can't have that life because you would have had to be in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. That's not your life. But what you can do is take the archetype and you can manifest it within the confines of your own life. And what that does is force you to undergo the difficult process of updating the ancient wisdom. And you don't just forego it. You can't, or you can, but you'll pay a massive price. And part of that will be social disintegration, because the past is alive enough so that those of us who inhabit its corpse aren't clawing each other to death while we're feeding, right? That's the critical issue. Now, it's not alive enough because the blood...
God, he's so florid with his language. Yes, we've become civilized over the long sweep of history for a host of reasons. One of them is our morality tales that we told around the fire. An example of these are any number of holy books you could point to.
Thing could fall apart at any moment, and we need to be awake and alert in order to keep it updated.
This is interesting because this is really where he lives. This is his thesis. That the moral fabric will disintegrate if we don't pay enough attention, enough attentional resources or respect or whatever you want to call it is paid to these texts that apparently had timeless wisdom. I mean, I couldn't disagree more. You could chuck it all and have lots to talk about still, lots of great stuff to move forward. By chuck it, I mean just keep it on the shelf next to the other fiction. Not burn the books, for goodness sakes.
Needed and maintained.
Well, not only that, but the greatest hazards to us in the present are only partially going to be dealt with in these texts, and that's my biggest concern. Is that if we take Dawkins dismissing religion as
so he just said really his biggest concern here, Brett Weinstein's biggest concern is the theologists aren't up to the task. How are we going to press these ancient books that have endless shortcomings to address this fast-moving 21st century culture and so on? So to me, that is I can only interpret that, and I don't think he meant it that way, as a call to arms to theology, to figure out a way to make this shit relevant again. I'll fight that cause. Not for that cause, against that cause.
Mind virus. This is very dangerous because
now he just
quoted
Dawkins, so let's hear it.
Well, not only that, but the greatest hazards to us in the present are only partially going to be dealt with in these texts, and that's my biggest concern. Is that if we take Dawkins dismissing religion as mind virus, this is very dangerous because it neglects the truth that you're talking about, and it prevents us from getting to a conversation in which we can talk about.
No. It's not dangerous to say that religions are mind virus. It's dangerous not to call out religion as mind virus. It's software that has major glitches in it. All right, with logical consistency. I mean, if you care about the U.S. Constitution, for example, if you like anything about the Bill of Rights, religion is most religions out there are going to be a gigantic problem for you. Okay, you can't have them simultaneously.
The fact that religions are not mind viruses. They are adaptations to past environments. They do contain a kind of truth that isn't necessarily literal and is in general not literal. But none of them, no ancient religion is up to date for Google's algorithms being the hazard to civilization that it probably is. We need to figure out how to navigate where the ancestral wisdom is simply not up to the current challenges.
Okay, so let me modify that slightly.
I mean, he again called for theologians to figure out how to make, how to draw a straight line from the New Testament to the ethics of Google algorithms. No, there's much better tactics than that, aren't there? As in, these are divisive, silly, violent texts that need to be dismissed. Silly, violent texts that need to be dismissed for what they are.
Because I think it's true and not true. The stories are...
There's the old Peterson again. I think it's true and not true. I mean, what, his mother teach him to do that? I agree and disagree. It's hot and cold. It's black and white.
Erroneous in detail and right in pattern. So, for example, there's an idea that one of the things that the mythological hero does is stand up against the tyranny of the state. Now, you don't have to specify the nature of the tyranny of the state in order for that to be a truth that's applicable across different contexts. And I would say what's happened with the great religious myths is that they operate at a level of abstraction such that the abstract entities are applicable in every single environment. I'll give you an example of that. It is extremely useful to represent the phenomenology of your experience as a domain of chaos and order. That works in every single environment for every person. And so the domain of order, if I can describe it technically. You're in the domain of order when your actions produce the result you desire. And you're in the domain of chaos when they don't. And then I could say, well, your task is to straddle the border between those.
I love how he goes into his self-help. You've got to straddle the border between chaos and order. I mean, it's a self-help line that goes nowhere. And he tries to... well, okay, listen.
Two domains, because you don't always want to be where everything that you're doing is working, because you don't learn anything. And you don't want to be where nothing you're doing is working, because it's overwhelming. You want to be stable and dynamic at the same point. And the Taoists do that very nicely, because they have a chaos-order conceptualization of the phenomenological landscape. And their claim is the point of maximum proper being is right at the center of the border between chaos and order. And I think that's true across contexts. So I don't think that truth ages.
Some of them don't. But the question really is one of, at what point is there so much legacy code that taking the package...
It's all legacy code, dudes. That's the problem. It's almost all legacy code. Okay, bad code. Bad operating system. And I'm talking about the specifics of the doctrine, not the people, obviously.
Is more harmful than it is beneficial. And at what point if God were writing today, I'm pretty convinced the first commandment would be, thou shalt not enrich uranium. It would make sense as the number one commandment. It's not there because uranium wasn't a concept at the point that the thing was written, nor was the hazard of enriching it obvious. And so the fact that it isn't mentioned tends to de-emphasize it as a risk. And so I guess...
It's a good point. Yeah, fair enough. He's making a point that many have made beforehand. You can't edit the books, as Sam said. But again, this introduces theologians. Quote Sam Harris, theologians are doing a hell of a lot of work trying to keep their books relevant. They're burning a lot of fuel trying to do that. Weinstein's saying they can't keep up. Well, I surely agree with that.
So the question is it possible, is it possible that by recognizing that these traditions carry huge amounts of ancestral wisdom forward, but that wisdom is certain to be so incomplete that it doesn't address modern questions, that we can be liberated to move forward and to honor those traditions for bringing us here, but to recognize that we actually have to move forward with something more potent and up-to-date, which is not easy, because you can't just take the scientific truth of the moment and implement. A lot of it isn't even right.
It's also not that easy to rewrite a fairy tale. And some of these fairy tales that people are trying to rewrite in modern times are perhaps 15,000 years old, and people think, well, we could just update that so that the modern version will be better. It turns out that that's very, very difficult. And there's another, I'm going to play devil's advocate against my own position.
That didn't address what he just said, by the way, at all.
Because I say religious texts encode profound and evolutionarily determined truths that are universal. Okay, which religious texts?
Right, they contradict each other.
And you might say, well, all of them, but then that means...
I hate when he says evolutionary truths. Absurd. Self-help bullshit. You mean useful knowledge?
That obscures the important differences between the traditions, and I'm by no means certain that all of them do. So I'm going to stick my neck way the hell out, because why not? It isn't obvious to me that Islam does, because it's very difficult for me to see that the totalizing nature of Islam doesn't make it unique among religions. So now, good. So, well, there's that out on the table.
If you don't mind.
It's so funny. Every religion wants to conquer the world. Certainly Christianity. You're called to fucking knock on your neighbor's door. But I like it. Thanks for slamming Islam anyway, Mr. Peterson. That's always appreciated, even out of your mouth.
But isn't the issue using the word truth? Because we can say, we could use tradition.
Joe Rogan fucking finally shows up to make a great point, which should have been made immediately. or maybe they're starting to discuss it now, which is the word truth is... That's a preacher's word, man. Truth. What do you mean truth? You mean facts? I mean, to me, it seems to me to discuss the word usage truth could trigger an hour-long conversation. To discuss the word usage of the word fact would precipitate a 20-second conversation with a room full of people. I think you get my point.
Tradition and wisdom, and we're okay. But as soon as we start saying truth, then we run into problems. I mean, and even when you're talking about porcupines, where you're talking about, what would you say, metaphorical truth versus... Look, it's not true. It's real simple. Just don't go near the porcupine. Teach the kid to not go near the porcupine, because porcupine quills are dangerous. They get stuck in you. They're really dangerous. Can they throw it at you? No, they cannot. But just stay clear of them, because you don't want them to somehow or another get in touch with your body. There's no truth in that they can throw their quills at you. You benefit from being particularly aware of the dangers of their quills. But if you tell a kid that they can throw their quills, and so therefore the kid stays clear of them, he has a faulty assumption in his head. You're lying to them for their own protection.
Oh, and I wouldn't...
Exactly. This is what I mentioned earlier. I mean, this is why, you know, dispute the usefulness of facts at your peril, dudes. Okay? What is Joe Rogan pointing out? He just pointed out that it doesn't help at all to tell kids, for example, or anyone, that they can throw their quills, because it's inaccurate information, and that could lead to bad outcomes in the physical universe, determinism, etc. Okay? Reality. So they start off with this, oh, religion is this... Not literally true. There's no science, of course. Science started in, well, 1500, really back to the Greeks in 500 BC, but you know, he points out the obvious, that these broad things that are narrowly inaccurate but broadly accurate, that pervade the culture, are actually bad software, dude. Just like Dawkins said, whatever you said, their mind disease. That's what it is, dude. It's bad thinking. And you're about to prove it with your own words.
Not good.
I wouldn't do it.
I think the same thing could be said of everything happens for a reason. Well, here's the problem. We don't know if everything happens for a reason. Maybe when you die, you go to some auditing room, and they go, well, you know, it's all just a part of some gigantic algorithm that it's impossible for you to understand due to your limited processing power of the human brain. You're dealing with some simian sort of complex geometry that's really just designed to keep your body moving and keep you alive and spread your genetics so that you can eventually evolve to the point when you're a god.
Well, first of all,
that's Rogan's favorite idea, that we have evolved only to give birth to machines, which will be much higher beings. He loves that idea. Smokes a lot of herb, you can tell. Love Rogan. Love that he threw that in. But more importantly, he threw in he's trying to be logically consistent and holding these guys to the fire. Now, it's granted, these guys did not swear on their children's lives that this is the way they feel, okay? I'm not accusing them of anything. I'm just pointing out bad thinking. So I think, let's keep going.
So I have kids. I wouldn't tell them that a porcupine...
I'm sure you wouldn't, but why use the word truth, though?
That's the same thing as saying I wouldn't give them any religion, correct? Because you compared the two, and you just said you wouldn't do it.
Because, well, the question is, why do people tell you that a porcupine can throw its quills?
I don't think they do.
Oh, they do.
Well, if they do, they don't know any better.
Right.
Or they're
why
liars.
Do people follow
and so
religion?
all I'm saying
it's
is
a
that
software
actually that
glitch.
is likely to be the product of selection. In other words, that those people who had encoded that they do throw their quills have an advantage. It's not the way I would do it, for exactly the reason that you point out, which is if you give a child the wrong model of a porcupine, I don't know whether a porcupine is liable to be the gateway to some more important question, but if it...
Just remember, he compared this analogy to religion. So he is saying he wouldn't give... This is the same as saying no religious thought either. No parables, no bullshit for the higher good, because it's bad information. Okay? So he's saying the same thing about religion. I wonder what JP's going to say.
You've just steered the kid wrong.
Well, it's something. Here's part of the problem. And this is a really big problem. There's two things, I guess, that were brought up by what you described. And the first is the terminology of truth. Now, Harris's claim with regards to my utilization of truth was that I was absconding with the definition of truth in a false manner. But he was wrong, because the idea of truth is much older than the idea of objective truth. And the original...
Dude, Harris deals in domains of facts. Facts are knowable, falsifiable, testable, repeatable observations about the universe. Truth, what does that mean?
Original notion of truth wasn't objective true. It was like the arrow flies straight and true. Right?
Like Harris isn't going to agree that there's fucking florid language in holy books about truth and what true may mean. And true might mean the divine right of kings. And so, I mean, like he reads, dude. He understands that.
Right. And it meant something like reliably on its way to the appropriate destination, something like that. And when Christ said, I am the truth and the way, when I can remember the end of it. Yes. The truth he was talking about wasn't an objective truth. So Sam's idea that I had somehow, taken the idea of truth that was actually objective all along and done something crooked with it is just wrong. It's wrong.
Well, so truth can have multiple definitions.
He took issue. This is important, okay? What he took issue with is your, and I tweeted this out, because I go and look up the philosophy. Just listen to this. Criticisms of Constructivist Epistemology. Okay. Numerous criticisms, this is from Wikipedia, I'll attach the link. Numerous criticisms have been leveled at Constructivist Epistemology. The most common one is that it either explicitly advocates or implicitly reduces to relativism, which Sam mentioned in the follow-up to these podcasts, okay? And it was pretty funny, actually. He mentioned eating its own tail. This is because it takes the concept of truth to be socially quote-unquote constructed, and thereby socially relative. This leads to the charge of self-refutation. If what is to be regarded as, quote, true is relative to a particular social formation, then this very conception of truth must itself be only regarded as being, quote, true in this society. In another social formation, it may well be false. If so, then social constructivism itself would be false in that social formation. Further, one could then say that social constructivism could be both true and false simultaneously. That is a reductio ad absurdum. Okay, that is a refutation, a sound, logical refutation, which Sam brought up by saying that truth is, or facts, I don't want to say the word truth, facts, are relative to the people who use those facts. The utility of those facts are what drive their truthiness, their factiness, factualness. That is absurd, it's circular, and it's not circular, it's a reductio ad absurdum. Okay? I'll attach this. Constructivist epistemology is laughable. Okay? And that's what Sam took issue with. Okay? Your conception of facts. You want to call truth, your version of truth, what's useful. Okay, fine. But that's not a domain of facts. Okay? There's your refutation. It's a little dry, but that's it, people. This is what you need to do when you hear this stuff. Okay? You need to hear when people talk bullshit. Now listen to this. I skimmed this earlier.
Well, that's the issue, and that's exactly what we're trying to get at here. It's like there's two kinds of truth, and they may be commensurate. You may be able to stack them on top of one another, but now and then they dissociate, and this is.
There's two kinds of truth. Should I do an hour on that video about two kinds of truth? Well, there certainly aren't two kinds of facts. If you want to claim in the world that there's two kinds of truths, I say there's 82 kinds. I'll list them in my next video.
Actually, what Brett was referring to as well. So, and this is where it gets so complicated that I can barely manage it. There's the truth that manifests itself in the manner in which you act. And there's the truth that manifests itself as a representation of the objective world. And sometimes both those truths are stacked on top of each other. And sometimes they're not. So, like, I could give you a piece of wisdom that would work well if you acted it out.
That didn't make sense, right? We are all part of the objective world. So unless you're a god or you're float free, that was word salad. Amongst many other word salads, but that was word salad.
That carried within it an inaccurate representation of part of the objective world. And you could say, well, maybe that's actually the case with the biblical stories, because if you read them as science, they don't read well.
So let's take malaria as a good example. Malaria, the root of the word is mal-area, bad air, right? Malaria is not transmitted by bad air. It's transmitted by mosquitoes that live in places where you might think the air is bad. So the point is, it's part of the way there.
Right? Yeah, that's a good one. And that also gets... See, there's another weird distinction here and that I was trying to draw with Sam, but that's a really tricky one. And we augured in because we started to talk about pragmatism, but there's also something like the truth of a description and the truth of a tool. And my sense is that people's fundamental truths are tool-like. We use them to function properly in the world. And you could say, well, a sharp axe is more true than a dull axe, and actually you can use the word true in that sense. That actually is an appropriate use of the word. There are tool truths and there are objective fact truths. Now, and in the optimal circumstance, those map onto each other. But we're not smart enough often to make them map onto each other because we just don't know enough. And there are lots of truths that we have that portray the objective world improperly that are still true.
Is the problem using the term true when sometimes you should use the term fact? Like
Joe Rogan, you must have a PhD in philosophy to stop this word salad nonsense. And, you know, people are going to put in the comment thread below that I just don't understand. I listen to lots of people, okay? And I listen really closely. And people make sense when they make sense, and they don't make sense when they don't make sense. I have no special knowledge, okay? I don't claim any special knowledge. Far from it. But Joe Rogan said, get this word truth out of here. You can jerk off with it all day long. Let's see what you think about facts.
Yes.
1 + 1 is 2, that is a fact. 1 + 1 is 2 is also true. You throw some water on a match, and it'll go out. That's a fact.
Yes.
Right? Well, as I see it, at least, there is this overarching truth, the one that Sam Harris was pointing to, the one I think you're pointing to also, and the one I'm imagining we all subscribe to.
Sure.
Right? There is the testable truth that reveals itself in the laboratory or in a careful experiment in the field. And that really is the top-level truth. But then there are the truths you can't speak yet. So let's take the word filth from the Old Testament. Okay? Filth means shit. Right? You're not supposed to shit in camp because God finds it offensive. Now, the problem is the germ theory of disease doesn't come about for thousands of years after that truth was written. That truth keeps you from infecting people long before you can ever explain that there are microbes that grow in human shit that are a particular danger to your population. So the point is, would you rather be held back to the place where you can actually describe the literal underpinnings of what's going on, or do you want to be liberated to say something that actually results in an improvement in health before, literally thousands of years before anybody had any idea that it was microbes at the root of this.
Yes, and you need to figure out. So
I'm liking this guy Brett Weinstein. He just pointed out again that this information is valueless because we've moved on. It's interesting to look at word usages and word origination. What is it, etymology or entomology? I always get them mixed up. One's the study of insects and one's the study of words. Their origins and so on. And it is close, and I love looking at that stuff, and that's really interesting. But he just made the point again that these half-truths found in these old books have been superseded. And theology isn't up to the task. I'm in his camp on this one, obviously.
So an elaboration of that would be something like human beings needed to figure out how to act without dying before they could understand the nature of the world well enough to justify that.
Right, and
something like that.
You'd be crazy, now that we do have the germ theory of disease, to amplify that original crude version of the truth, or that crude approximation of what you need to believe in order to behave safely. There's no reason for that truth to
no point in
be
amplifying
promoted.
this
in
stuff.
fact, you don't hear people describing this part of
bad software.
The Old Testament anymore.
It's true.
It's not relevant.
Right.
And this is probably all why dietary restrictions were in the Old Testament as well. Shellfish, red tide, eating pigs, trichinosis. There's a lot of issues that go along with that.
Yeah, well, there is some intermingling, perhaps, of hygienic concerns with also the desire for the groups to distinguish themselves from other groups, right? Because you can unite your group quite tightly by dietary restrictions. So, back to your point about terminology, we could do something like fact and wisdom. You say truth, that's the overarching category, and then that divides into fact and wisdom. And what you want, optimally, is you want the facts and the wisdom to be one-to-one, but often they're not. And if you find wisdom where the facts aren't laid right out, you don't just get to throw away the wisdom, which is what I think happens in the case of people like Dawkins and Harris. And Harris makes another sleight of hand move, which I don't like, which is...
Wisdom is an accumulation of a certain type of fact, boyo. Did a bunch of gods show up? And think about next steps in your thesis. Where did this wisdom come from? Lives lived. Knowledge accumulated. Knowledge is reducible to facts about the universe. Okay? What in the world are you talking about?
He thinks, so let's say, except for just a second, the wisdom-fact distinction, he would say, well, the fact is the thing, and the wisdom is a second-order derivation of that. You can ground the wisdom in the fact, and I don't believe that, and I don't think that he has any real justification for that claim. I mean, this is something I never got.
That's what I just said. So what is wisdom? It's not an accumulation? What is it then? Did it land here by spaceship from aliens?
By grounding the wisdom in the fact.
He thinks if you know the facts clearly enough, you'll know how to act.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
Well,
there's ways to act that are within your best interest, and then there's ways to act that are within the interest of all the people around you, but might not serve you that well.
Well,
and
there's
that
also
only distinction is where ethics come
right,
into
or where the consequences are delayed for some number of generations or something like that.
Yes, well, that's a big problem.
Also facts.
So Sam acts as if the process of mapping facts onto action is simple if we just got the facts right, but it's the weakest part of his argument, and we never... So,
the weakest part of his argument is we have to get all the facts we can get. You're contending we don't? You disagree with that? What facts do you reject? What facts do you reject?
Never ever got to that for a variety of reasons, but part of the reason it's weak is, okay, well, there's like an infinite number of facts, man. So let's say you're standing in front of a field and you're looking at the field.
This is hilarious. I heard him say this earlier. This is hilarious.
The field does not tell you how to walk through it. There's a million ways through the field. And no matter how many facts about the field you aggregate, you're not going to be able to determine the appropriate path by aggregating those facts.
Yes, you are. What if... Dude, your own analogy is a fucking joke. What are you talking about? You could know geometry. What's the shortest point between A and B is a straight line. Okay, so you're going to go straight line. Does the topography work out for you? Is there a path? The resistance to the path. Animals. We could know about zoology. We could scare them away with noises. If we send a team of scientists there and people out in the field, we could have a domain of facts to get through that field, whatever our concerns: speed, stealth, impact to the environment, probability that a fire will start or not start, and so on. What in the world? You'll never be able to come up with analogies because there aren't any, because it doesn't work.
So that's a problem that I don't think Sam is willing to take seriously. And well,
I think there are two problems tangled up.
What isn't he willing to take seriously? We have a domain of facts. The rest is bullshit, dude. What else do you want us to say? We got a domain of facts, and we got to do something. It's never going to be perfect, and we have to move. Well, then give me the best, most facts regarding proximate causes. What information are you going to operate with, and when? When are you going to forego that? The answer is never.
One of them is, there's a question of, is one individual supposed to have all of the facts and navigate based on that, sort of the rationality community version of things? Or does, the practical truth is we can't all be experts in everything, and so we have to go along with, guides to our behavior that are approximate, and that's inherent. And then there's a question about civilization. Civilization should be guided by our best understanding of what's actually true, but with an understanding that we don't have a complete map of a lot of stuff. And so I think what you're pointing at is that there is wisdom that has been handed to us that is not such that we can just simply say, oh, here's the nugget at the center of it, and we need to preserve that thing, because we don't necessarily know what it's doing. Which is, this is dangerous, because some of what it's doing may not be acceptable.
Well, and then let's look at the wisdom end of things for a minute.
Right. So Weinstein already said that it's useless. It's useless because it's been superseded, the malaria. He's already conceded that theology can't keep up with the Google algorithm analogy. So it's superseded software. The code writers can't keep up with the updates. And now he just said it's dangerous. I'm going to agree with him again.
You alluded a little earlier to iterations and about the fact that things are iterated across time, and that something that works now might fail dreadfully in a month or 2 months. So,
yep.
So here's what something has to be like to be wise, let's say. Well, first of all, let's say it would be good if it was in accordance with the facts, but we'll leave that aside for now.
Facts are never a huge stumbling block for my man Jordan Peterson. It would be nice if there were facts. You think?
It has to work, if you operate according to the wisdom principle, whatever it is, it has to work in the world. But then it has to work in a world that allows you to maintain your relationships with people in the world, right? So it's all of a sudden this wisdom thing is something that's not only constrained by, let's call it objective reality, but it's constrained by the necessity of a social contract, a functional social contract. So you're only allowed to put forward actions in the world that would be of benefit to you if they simultaneously don't undermine the structure within which you live. Okay, and then there's a game theory element to that, which is, well, if it's wise, then it works in the world, so that'd be the constraint of objective reality. But then it works for you now, and the you that'll be in a week, and the you that'll be in a month, and it works for you and your family, and it works for you and your family and society, and it works in a way that those things all line up.
Why aren't these all facts? Why aren't these are reducible to facts? If not, what is wisdom then, my friend? You're saying wisdom is facts that help the family, the culture, and so on. All right, you want to define wisdom that way, that's fine. But how are you not dealing with a domain of facts based on the value judgments you're making about what proceeds if someone lives in this fashion. Follow me? Still getting down to facts, still have no room for crappy software that's been disproved, that is dangerous and can't be updated. It's faulty.
To be iterated across time. And so this is actually also the solution, and I'd really like to hear what you think about this. I think this is the solution to the postmodern conundrum. Because
hilarious that he brought up postmodernism again. I mean, this guy's got a hard-on. He thinks everybody in the world who doesn't think like him is a postmodernist. I mean, it's really hilarious. I mean, friends, read the Wikipedia page on postmodernism. Understand what it is. Enjoy it. And move on.
Postmodernists, bless their heart, so we'll give the devil his due, say, well, the problem is there's an infinite number of interpretations of a finite set of facts. And
no, there aren't. Okay? There aren't an infinite number of interpretations on the facts. That's bullshit. I'm sorry.
Right response to that is, oh, that's true. That's true. That's not good. And that's why the postmodernists say, well, you can't agree on a canonical interpretation of a great piece of literature, because the number of potential interpretations are infinite. And so then they say, well, why should we settle on any one interpretation then? Why should we privilege one over another? And then they say, well, that's all power games. And so that's you got to take that.
Bad, dude, bad. Not good.
Seriously, but what they missed, and this is a big deal, it's a big deal, I think, is this idea of ethical constraint. It's like, yes, there's a landscape of potentially infinite interpretations, but hardly any of them will work in the real world. And hardly any of them will work in the real world in a way that doesn't get you killed by other people or...
Well, then there aren't an infinite amount.
...or doom you because of your own stupidity to failure across time. And so, the landscape...
By not taking facts into account.
...of interpretation is almost infinite, but the landscape of applicable interpretation, functional interpretation, is unbelievably constrained. And I think that constraint system is what we regard as ethics. It's something like that.
Yeah, the guy's using the word landscape. Harris wrote a book called The Moral Landscape. You should read it. All right, that's over. I mean, it's hilarious that he used the word landscape a few times, but he didn't say anything. It was all mundane bullshit. So, look, I just want to make the point that this 29 and a half minutes, not that much of Harris, but this is important, okay? He got Harris wrong again, in that Harris just made the point that if we can't talk about what we think facts are, if we don't have a work, our conversation is going to go nowhere. And your view of constructivist epistemology is a reductio ad absurdum that, as he pointed out, eats its own tail. It goes nowhere. Okay, so stop saying. And then you draw your own analogies. You and Weinstein draw your own analogies about things that are false that help you survive, and then they go on to refute how they would never use it, and it doesn't work. You're never going to find an example where deviating from the facts. I mean, flukes aside, okay? I'm not talking about a fluke, okay? There's holes in ones, but that's not how golf is. The score in golf is determined. The scoring in golf is determined, okay? There are flukes. So they basically, I don't want to put words in Peterson's mouth, but he basically, his buddy there, Weinstein, goes on a hit parade on how valueless this software is. Okay, and generally I agreed. They went after Dawkins for calling it what it is, which Weinstein agreed. Okay, again, I don't care, you call it wisdom, truth, whatever, Harris is a materialist, a domain of facts. Wisdom is an accumulation of facts. We're always talking about facts. Values themselves reduce to facts about the universe. If I'm a scientist, and instead of hiding data, I don't want to, that doesn't look good to my thesis, okay? If I hide that data, that is a transgression of ethics. That's values. Okay, but the facts would change. I would change facts, subsequent data, okay, by not including that information, okay? And then our domain of facts are wrong. That's what's wrong with it, okay? I don't know how many different ways you can point out that myths are great. That he started off with this man, this Superman type figure. Well, that isn't in this universe. It's okay. That's a story. That's fiction. That's not us. Okay. Everything is reducible to facts. That's what Sam was talking about. You can call truth whatever you want. Okay. But your idea of truth has been refuted as silly and eating its own tail. Okay. And relativistic. I'll include the links. Thank you for listening. This is Bulldog out.